Okay, picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, you make your coffee, you open your phone, and the headline reads, Norway officially joins the European Union. You'd probably think it was a joke, a prank. Maybe you accidentally clicked on a satirical news site. But here's the thing. Norway joining the EU isn't some far-fetched fantasy. It's not a crazy hypothetical. It's actually something that's been on the table for decades, something that Norway has voted on twice, something that's still debated in Norwegian parliament to this day. So today we're going to do something fun. We are going to answer the question, what would actually happen if Norway joined the EU and why, after all this time, it still hasn't? Because the answer is weirder, richer, and more dramatic than you think. Let's start at the beginning. Norway is surrounded by EU members. Sweden joined in 1995, Finland joined in 1995, Denmark has been in since 1973. Norway sits right there in the middle of Scandinavia, deeply integrated with Europe in almost every way: trade, travel, culture, politics, and yet it has never been a member of the EU. Why? Because the Norwegian people voted against it. Not once, twice. The first referendum was in 1972. Norway had actually negotiated a membership deal. The paperwork was basically done and then they put it to a public vote. The result, 53.5% said no. The government was stunned. It was one of the closest and most emotionally charged votes in Norwegian history. Then in 1994, after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the EU expanded, after the Maastricht Treaty transformed the European community into the fully fledged European Union, Norway voted again. Surely, this time with Europe more unified than ever, they'd say yes. 52.2% said no. Even closer, even more dramatic. And so Norway ended up doing something fascinating. Instead of joining the EU, it joined the EEA, the European Economic Area, which is basically the EU minus the political union, minus the voting rights, minus the agricultural and fisheries policy. But with full access to the single market. Norway pays into the EU budget, it follows EU regulations, its citizens can live and work freely across Europe, but it has absolutely no seat at the table when those rules are made. Norwegians have a name for this arrangement, they call it fax democracy. The EU sends a fax with the new regulations, Norway says yes sir and implements them. Which brings us to the first great irony of this story. Here's something that blows people's mind when they first hear it. Norway is, by most measures, one of the wealthiest countries on earth. GDP per capita, one of the highest in the world. The Norwegian government pension fund, also known as the oil fund, is the largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet, sitting at over 2.2 trillion US dollars. That's not a typo. Trillion with a T. Norway struck oil in the North Sea in the late 1960s, and instead of spending it all immediately, they did something almost no oil-rich nation has done. They saved it. They built a fund for future generations, and now that fund owns, on average, about 1.5% of every publicly listed company in the entire world. So when Norway looks at the EU and asks, what's in it for us? The honest answer is, not that much financially. Norway doesn't need EU subsidies. Norway doesn't desperately need access to EU markets. It already has that through the EEA. Norway isn't a post-communist economy trying to modernize with EU structural funds. Norway is frankly doing great on its own, and that creates a very particular political dynamic. In most countries that want to join the EU, there is an economic argument. EU membership means prosperity, stability, investment. But in Norway, that argument doesn't land because Norway is already prosperous, already stable, already attracting investment. The people who oppose EU membership in Norway, and they're consistently around 60 to 70% of the population in recent polls, they're not anti-European, they're not nationalists in some extreme sense. Many of them are actually proud of Norway's international cooperation, its foreign aid commitments, its role in global peacekeeping. They just don't want to give up control. And that brings us to the thing Norwegians care most about, the thing that actually explains everything. No, seriously, it's about the fish. Well, it's about the fish and the farms and the sovereignty, but let's start with the fish. Norway has one of the most valuable fishing industries in the world. The Norwegian coast, the fjords, the Arctic waters, they're extraordinarily rich in marine life. Cod, salmon, mackerel, herring. Norway exports billions of dollars of seafood every year. Now, the EU has a common fisheries policy, a system where EU member states share access to each other's waters. The idea is that fishing rights are distributed across the bloc, which, from a Norwegian perspective, sounds like an absolute nightmare. Opening up Norwegian waters to European fishing fleets, allowing EU bureaucrats in Brussels to set quotas for Norwegian fish. No thank you. The same goes for agriculture. The EU's common agricultural policy involves deep subsidies and market integration. Norway has its own highly protected farming sector, small farms, family-run operations deeply tied to Norwegian identity and landscape. EU membership would expose that sector to a whole new competitive reality. And then there is the broader sovereignty question. Norway is not a small country in terms of self-confidence. It has a strong national identity built in part around the fact that it only gained full independence in 1905 after centuries of Danish and then Swedish rule. The idea of handing power to a supranational institution in Brussels, an institution where Norway would be one of 28 or 29 members, a relatively small voice, that cuts against something deep in the Norwegian political psyche. Norwegian voters look at the EU and they see bureaucracy, they see compromises, they see slow grinding consensus politics. And then they look at Norway and they see a country that makes its own decisions quickly, efficiently, with direct democratic accountability. Why trade that in? Now, to be fair, and we should be fair, there are serious, thoughtful Norwegians who believe their country should join the EU, and their arguments deserve real attention. The first argument is geopolitical. The world changed dramatically in 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Norway, which shares a border with Russia and the far north, is an active NATO member and deeply concerned about European security. The argument goes, in a world where Russia is once again an aggressive power, where the US commitment to NATO is uncertain, where Europe needs to deepen its own security cooperation, maybe Norway should be more fully integrated, not less. There is a real case that Norway's influence in Brussels, even as a relatively small country, would be greater than its current influence as an outsider looking in. The second argument is about the fax democracy problem we mentioned earlier. Norway already follows most EU rules. It has to maintain its single market access, but it has no vote on those rules. Every time the EU updates a regulation on financial services, on digital markets, on environmental standards, Norway has to decide, implement it or risk losing market access. It almost always implements it. So Norway is, in practice, governed significantly by EU law without any of the rights that come with membership. Isn't that worse than just joining? There's a democratic deficit there that even some EU skeptics acknowledge is uncomfortable. The third argument is about Norway's long-term relationship with its neighbors. Sweden and Finland are both in the EU. Denmark is in the EU, though it has opt-outs. The Nordic Council and Nordic cooperation have always been central to Norwegian foreign policy, and as the EU becomes more integrated, as EU defense cooperation deepens, as the Eurozone evolves, as European political identity strengthens, Norway risks becoming more and more of an outsider in its own neighborhood. So we have a rich country surrounded by EU members that follows EU rules but has no vote and yet consistently refuses to join. How is that still the situation in 2026? The short answer: political will. None of Norway's major political parties currently make EU membership a priority issue. The Labour Party, which governs most of the time, was actually split on the EU in both referenda. The Conservative Party is broadly pro-EU but has learned not to make it a frontline campaign issue. The Centre Party and the Progress Party are fiercely opposed. And the voters' polls consistently show majority opposition. The wound from those two referenda still hasn't fully healed. Politicians who push EU membership are seen as out of touch, as elitists, as not listening to the Norwegian people. There's also a fascinating generational dynamic. Younger Norwegians are, on average, more pro-EU than older generations. They've grown up in a borderless Europe, studying in European universities, working across the continent, seeing themselves as European as much as Norwegian. Some polls show under 40s are roughly split on EU membership. But roughly split isn't enough to call a referendum. You need a clear majority to overcome the political cost of trying and failing a third time. A third failed referendum might kill the idea for a generation. Alright, let's do the fun bit. Let's say, hypothetically, that Norway held a referendum tomorrow. And let's say, against all current polling, that the yes side won. Norway is joining the EU. What happens next? First, the negotiations. EU accession isn't instantaneous. It typically involves years of negotiation, screening of laws, transitional periods, but Norway is a special case. It already follows most EU law through the EEA, so the process might be faster than for a typical candidate country. Still, you'd be looking at a minimum of 2 to 3 years before full membership. Norway would almost certainly negotiate hard on fisheries. No way they open up Norwegian waters without significant protections. Denmark negotiated fishing opt-outs in 1973. Norway would likely demand something similar, or at minimum, a very long transition period. On agriculture, similar story, a strong pressure for protections for Norwegian farmers given how different their situation is from continental European farming. Second, the currency question. Norway uses the Norwegian krone, not the euro. EU membership doesn't automatically mean adopting the euro. Sweden has been in the EU since 1995 and still uses the krona. Norway would almost certainly stay with the krone for the foreseeable future. Given the size of the oil fund, managing the exchange rate relationship between the krone and the euro would be a significant economic policy challenge. Third, the political impact. Norway getting a seat at the table in Brussels would be interesting. With a population of around 5.5 million, it would be one of the smaller member states comparable to Finland or Denmark. Not tiny, but not a powerhouse like Germany or France. Its influence would be strongest in areas where it has deep expertise: maritime policy, energy, fisheries, Arctic affairs, and increasingly AI and tech given its sovereign wealth fund investments. Fourth, the social impact. Freedom of movement already exists under the EEA, so this is less of a change than it might seem. Norwegian citizens can already live and work anywhere in the EU, but formal membership might create deeper cultural and political integration over time. More Norwegians studying Erasmus, more Norwegians engaging with European political parties and institutions, a stronger sense of shared European identity. And fifth, perhaps most interestingly, the psychological impact. There is something profound about the idea of Norway finally saying yes after 50 years of saying no. It would be a major statement about European integration, about the direction of the continent, about what it means to be European in the 21st century. It would probably be the biggest political story in Europe for that entire year. So, is Norway joining the EU tomorrow? No. Definitely not tomorrow, probably not this year, probably not this decade, if you are being honest. The economic incentive isn't strong enough, the political will isn't there, the voters, even as they shift, aren't at a clear majority yet, and the memory of two failed referenda casts a long shadow. But here's what I find genuinely fascinating about Norway's situation. It's a country that has managed to find a third way. Not fully in, not fully out, but deeply intertwined with the EU in a relationship that is unique in the world. The EEA is sometimes called the closest thing to EU membership without actually being a member. And Norway has used that position, that ambiguity, that space to stay wealthy, democratic, and sovereign. Whether that's a sustainable long-term position, especially in an increasingly fractured geopolitical world, is genuinely one of the most interesting questions in European politics. Because the question isn't just, will Norway join the EU? The real question is, what is Europe? And who gets to be part of it? Norway's answer to that question for 50 years has been, we'll decide for ourselves. And honestly, that's a very Norwegian answer. Thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button.